All right, everyone. So I want to welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you for being here. We still have a few folks that haven't signed in yet, but to be respectful of everyone's time, we will get started. And in any case, we are recording today's webinar, so we will share that with them, and we will share that with you all as well. So I wanted to start off by just introducing our group and then introducing our presenter today. So we are the doctoral organization for the collaboration of scholars, docs for short. And the service that we try to provide is information for students and for faculty alike with regards to developing manuscripts, scholarly writing, publications, article publications, or even the development of dissertations. So with that said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get together different workshops, different initiatives that can help those folks develop their writing further and whatever manuscripts that they're trying to develop, just acquire additional skills to help them with that process. Today's workshop is on APA. It's titled, as you can see, APA Style Upgrade, Writing with the 7th edition of the APA Publication Manual. I want to say as of, it was mid-October when APA moved from the 6th edition to the 7th edition, and this workshop is in response to that move. Our presenter today is Dr. Kendahl Shortway, and Dr. Shortway also presented the same material on January 28th in 2 different workshops. So this is almost a re-presentation of those 2 workshops, but in webinar form. Dr. Shortway understands APA 7 pretty well, even though she will tell you that she is not a representative of APA, but she knows it very well, and we are very happy that she's been able to put this presentation together for us and presenting this presentation for us today. So without further ado, Dr. Shortway, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today, or if you're listening to the recording, I'm glad that you can join us and listen and go along with the PowerPoint in the future. And I am open if you have questions throughout and you want to ask them, you're welcome to. So to do that, you would have to unmute yourself because you're automatically muted when you join. And then you would have to mute yourself after you ask the question unless you wanted to still be heard. So feel free at any point, you can go ahead and ask questions. There may be points too that I'll give some pause and see if you have any questions. You could also save any questions for the end, and I'll make sure to give some time for questions and answers at the very end. We did schedule the webinar from 12 to 1. It may not take up that whole time though, just so you know, but if you have to leave at any point, of course, you're welcome to leave. If you need to rejoin, you're welcome to rejoin. All right, so welcome to our first webinar. And again, this is being presented by docs. As mentioned, I do not represent the American Psychological Association, the APA. I have self-learned the manual, so of course you should consult with the manual or any of the APA resources if you have questions. And also it's important to check with your department and your faculty members regarding expectations for the use of the new edition. So during this transition period, it's likely that some programs and departments will have students transition earlier, others maybe a little later, or even within your program, you may have faculty members who maybe aren't super familiar with the new edition, and that could be reflected in the grading. So make sure that you ask all of your professors and instructors anytime before you're handing something in of what edition of APA style they're expecting of you. Okay, so an overview of the webinar, we're going to be talking about what is APA style. We'll talk about some of the purposes and advantages of writing in APA style. I'm going to cover the major changes from the 6th to the 7th editions and the guidelines specific to student papers. I'm also going to spend some time talking about common APA style errors. So just a review of APA style as a whole. And we'll have some time hopefully for a writing activity and some questions and answers and discussion. And again, if you have questions at all along the way, you're welcome to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask the question. So many of you are probably already familiar with APA style, though you may not know the history of it. I'm an enthusiast of APA style because I appreciate that it gives some structures and rules. I do think though it can feel like extra work or difficult to learn. So just taking a moment to appreciate why we have it. So it's used in most of the social and behavioral sciences and beyond for student papers and also for scientific journals. So when you submit manuscripts for publication, most journals are expecting that it's an APA style, especially if it's in the social or behavioral sciences. And although it's published by the American Psychological Association, there are different publishers who expect it internationally that they would be consistent with APA style. And on the bottom here, you can see just how the editions have changed throughout time, with the newest edition having tabs. So it's a much easier reference. I actually bought the edition that doesn't have the tabs. I think it was $20, $25 less to not have the tabs. But I know people have been appreciating that you can easily turn to different sections in the manual and also that it's bound differently. So again, just to grow some appreciation for why we have APA style, especially for those who maybe get frustrated with it, I'd like to think of it like it gives us boundaries, rules, expectations. And if you can think of if there were sports without rules or field lines, it would be really hard to play the sport with other people. We wouldn't know what we were watching as spectators. We wouldn't really know what's happening, and it'd be really hard to practice. So if you think of it in this way, APA style, it gives all of us as writers a way to communicate. And because we don't have to develop our own format, we can universally communicate to others without also having to communicate what type of format we're using. So it really gives us a shared way to communicate through our writing. So we know where to look for information when we're reading something that's in APA style. So for example, if I'm reading a paper in APA style and I were to see a citation in parentheses, I know that that's a citation. I would know that there's going to be a reference list at the end of the paper, and I would know how to then go for myself to see that reference. So these are things we could take for granted, but it's really because we share the same formatting that we can have these expectations. Give students a structure to follow. So when you're writing for assignments, it can be sometimes hard enough to meet all of the other requirements of the assignment. And if you at least know you're expected to write in APA format, that's something that can be consistent throughout all of your courses and your years in school. And again, it's also something that we can use to communicate across countries and across cultures. It can be frustrating to learn, but ultimately it does save time and confusion. So credit to you for listening to this webinar today. I do think that you putting in the time to listen and follow with this will save you time later on, especially as everyone is transitioning to the new edition. And they also allow us consistency, accessibility, and ethical writing. So this is something people may not know, but APA style is also based with ethics and also to prioritize and maximize accessibility. So that's really important. And like all skills, writing in APA style entails practice and learning. So myself included, as we transition to APA 7, we're going to be making mistakes, and that's okay. We can always go back to the manual, and the more we write this way, the more we'll learn, and it'll start to become intuitive, just like it may have felt for APA 6 or if you've used any of the earlier editions. So again, today I'm really going to focus on some of the major changes. I won't be covering all of them. I'm trying to cover the ones that are most relevant, especially for student writing. And here you can just see what the 6th edition looked like. And again, the 7th edition, it's pretty fancy with the tabs. All right, so let's start with some noticeable changes in appearance. So on the left here, you can see all of the acceptable fonts that you can use to be consistent with APA style. So the way that I have these fonts on here, they're all the same size. And you can see that the one that says 10 point actually appears larger. So that's why, depending on the font you use, there's different requirements for the size of the font. My personal favorite is 12 point Times New Roman, but there are other ones added, and some of these are added for accessibility. For people that are using different types of programs and screens, it can be helpful if they use different fonts because they appear differently. Even though all of these fonts are now okay for APA style, you really need to talk to your instructor for each course because they may have expectations based on their preferences. For example, I mentioned I love 12 point Times New Roman. I don't see any reason to change that. So I would still expect that my students are using 12-point Times New Roman. So talk about that with your instructor. On the right side of the screen, you can see some of the changes to the student title page format. So first of all, there are different requirements if it's a student paper versus if it's a professional paper. And some of the differences, the main differences, have to do with the title page. So this is the new title page format if it's a student paper. And I'm just going to talk through some of the changes. You can take a moment to notice if you see any of the differences. So one thing, and I know a lot of students are really happy about this, you no longer have to have a running head. So there's not a running head that's introduced on the first page, on the title page. There's not a running head at all through the document. Again, though, ask your instructor. For whatever reason, some faculty members may still expect that you include a running head. You'll also notice that the title of the paper is now bold. So you'll be putting that in boldface. Below that would be your name. Below that, you are including the course title, both the number and the written title of the course. Below that is your instructor's name for that course. And then you're also including the date. The date on your title page should be the date that the assignment is due, not necessarily the date that you finished it. And we still have the page number, and it's in the top right. It's important that the page number is written into the document as a header. So I've seen sometimes students enter the page number manually. You can go to header in Word, and then you're gonna insert page number. And again, now you don't have to worry about running head, so that process is going to be easier. And also note that the page numbers need to be consistent with the font size and font type of the writing in your paper. So Word doesn't necessarily do that. I think it actually defaults to something else. So you have to make sure that they are consistent with each other. And again, make sure you talk to your course instructor to see if there's any preferred font. Also note that the fonts are different sometimes for figure images, for computer codes, and also if there's footnotes included in your paper. Okay, the next major change is the changes to the headings. So headings should be used throughout papers written in APA style to delineate sections. So it's sort of like if you were reading an outline, you have main headings and then there may be subheadings. And that lets the reader know that these fit under that larger heading, but there may be subtopics of the major topic. So there's no heading for the introduction. So sometimes students will start their paper with introduction. There's no heading for that because it's implied. It's the start of your paper, it's the beginning, it's the introduction. You don't need to include that. What should be at the start of your paper is the title of your paper repeated, and that should be as a level 1 heading. So that would be centered and bold in title case heading. Whenever you hear title case heading, that means that you're capitalizing each word. So after you've restated the title at the very start of your paper, any other headings you're using or subheadings would start with level 2. So you can see below, I have the format and the level. So format for level 1 heading is the same as it was in the earlier edition. Format for level 2 heading is the same. And then for 3, 4, and 5, it's different. So for 3, it's flush left, it's bold and italic, and it's title case heading. And it's not until level 4, you're indenting, it's still bold, it's still title case heading, so that's different, and you are ending with a period. You would start your text right after the period, so you're not going down to another line. And then 3 and 5 are very, very similar. The only difference is that 5 is indented. So again, these are different level headings. In the earlier edition, when you got to the lower level headings, it wasn't in title case, and the period where the writing would start happened earlier. So this is important to learn. It's probably gonna look a little odd at first. I've especially noticed it with the level 2 to the level 3 headings. And again, so this is important for you to be familiar with. Because I mentioned spacing, I think I'll just add this here. Your entire paper in APA style should be double spaced. Word typically has a default setting that it's adding space between paragraphs. So that's why sometimes you'll double space your paper and then there'll be extra space. You have to actually go into your paragraph settings. You have to tick a little box that says do not add space between paragraphs, and that will take care of that for you. Okay, the next major change are the changes to your in-text citations. So if you remember from the previous edition, anytime you had more than 2 authors and up to 5 authors, so 3 to 5 authors, you were including every author on the first citation, and then you were saying et al. Going forward. You no longer have to do that. So this is actually something that's going to be simpler. When there are 2 authors, you're including both every single time. If it's more than 2, you're only including the first author every single time. So you're never writing out all of the authors. So you can see I have that example there with the second bullet. It says Shortway et al. If I had 3 other authors, if I had 4 other authors, if I had 5, it doesn't matter. I'm doing et al. From the very beginning. And for those who don't know, et al. Is just a way of saying and others. So if you were ever presenting this information orally, you could say Shortway and others, and it would be communicating the same thing. I know sometimes I'm not sure how to say that. So you can just say and others, it gets the same message across. The only tricky point here is that if there's multiple authors in the same references, you do need to include as many authors to avoid ambiguity. So you can see here in my example, if I had Shortway, Giordano, so we were both included in 2 different references, I have to include other ones until it's clear that these are 2 different references. So Shortway, Giordano, Kitzinger et al., Shortway, Giordano, Weber et al. If there was only 3 authors, so if it was just Shortway, Giordano, and Kitzinger, I'm not adding et al. I'm only doing et al. Because there's more than 1 author after Kitzinger. So I'm just going to repeat some of that just to make sure that's clear. So 2 authors, you're doing both every single time. If it's a citation within parentheses, you're using the ampersand. That's that fancy symbol for and. If it's more than 2 authors, from the very first in-text citation, you're just doing the first author et al. If there's multiple references who share the same authors, you're listing as many authors as you need to make it clear which reference you're referring to. And just a reminder, just a tip, you can use narrative citations. So that's when the author's name is part of the writing. For example, if I were to say, Shortway found in her study, or I can do a parenthetical citation, and that would be if I maybe said, it was found in a study, and then in parentheses, Shortway, comma, 2020. So both are acceptable. There's really not a rule for why you should be doing one or the other. I think papers often read and flow the best if there's a mix of both. Also, avoid over-citation or under-citation. So let's say in one paragraph, you're continuously referring to the same study or reference. If you've already cited that reference, and then you continue to write sentences that are referring to that reference, you don't need to keep adding that citation. You're only citing references when you need to make it clear and less ambiguous about what you're referring to. Also, if you've included the author's name and the year, and in the same paragraph, you're citing that author, and it's a narrative citation, you don't need to include the year. So if you look again on that top line where it says you can use a narrative citation, if this was later in a paragraph where I had already put Shortway 2020, I now can just say Shortway because it's implied. I'm referring to the same reference and it's the same year. If it was a parenthetical citation, even though I had already referred to that reference within the same paragraph, I'm adding the year again. The next major change are changes to the reference list format. So while we saw with the changes in citations, less authors get credit by having their name written in the text, but in the reference list, more authors get credit. So for references that have multiple authors, up to 20 authors, you are going to include their surnames, which is commonly, we say last names, and the initials for every author in that reference. If there were more than 21 authors, you're including the surnames and initials for the first 19, and then an ellipsis, which is that ... No ampersand, which is the fancy and sign, and then just the final author's name. So I know some people had a reaction like, wait, those other authors don't get credit anywhere. It's pretty rare for there to be more than 21 authors. or even more than 20 authors. And it's also part of most ethical principles in disciplines within behavioral sciences that the list of authorship goes in order of contributions, meaning the first author contributed the most, the second author contributed the second most, and so on. So really, if there are more than 20 authors, it's probably that their contributions were minimal. And again, it's pretty rare to see that many authors in a document. I do want to mention, though, that in other disciplines, it doesn't always follow that order. There are some disciplines where authors go in alphabetical order on a reference, or sometimes a faculty member or the leader of a research lab may always put their name last. Another major change, and I felt some relief for this because I have definitely Googled around trying to find locations of publishers, is that you do not need to include the location of the publisher when you're using a reference for a book. So here's an example. I have 3 authors, the year, the title of the book, which by the way is written in lowercase aside from the first word. That's a common mistake. The edition, and then I have the author, or I'm sorry, the publisher, the American Psychological Association. I no longer need to include the location. So I did not need to include Washington, D.C., American Psychological Association. Just while we're on this, I want to mention something too about the title of the book. So as I said, the title of the book, the first word is uppercase, the rest is lowercase. The exception would be if in the title there was a colon. If there is a colon in the title, the first word after the colon would also be uppercase. There's also no more DOI, and there's no more retrieve from, although there are some exceptions to that. Instead, we're just going to insert the hyperlink directly into the document. And the reason for both of these changes is because most of the information shared, even that's published in journals, is now accessed online and virtually. So it's really not necessary to know the location of a publisher. At one point it may have been, but since we're able to access so many publications just through the internet, the location is less relevant. And the same for DOI and retrieve from. Instead, we're going to be able to just click directly and take us to that reference, which I think is going to be really helpful, especially when we're reading other people's work. Say if you're doing a literature review, and often one reading takes you to another, and it's all based on the same topic, you'd be able to go to the reference list and just click on those links, and you'll go directly to that source, assuming you have access to that source. Which, side note, if you're logged into Kent Library, there's a good chance that you may. Just a tip here, if you use Google or EndNote or any other online platform to help you format your reference list, definitely double check it. So I like to use Google. So if you're using Google Scholar and you're looking at a reference and you click on the quotation marks, it will give you a list of different types of ways to reference that writing. I often will copy and paste how they're saying APA style is, and then I know to revise it because Google makes a lot of mistakes. And as I write on here, it's something that we can still do better than robots. So if you use it maybe as a guideline, make sure you double check because we can't expect that Google Scholar, EndNote, etc. are doing it correctly. Here are some of the additional changes in the 7th edition. So you're using one space after the period at the end of a sentence. I think many of us have started to do this anyway, but technically you were supposed to use 2 spaces after every period. You're going to be using quotation marks around examples instead of putting it in italics. And this is a point that's important for accessibility. This is easier for people who are using assistive technologies, so for them to delineate changes in the writing with quotation marks versus having it be italicized. There's also more flexibility for lists. So whether you use a bulleted list, a lettered list, or a numbered list, you as the author have more flexibility around that, but there are specific guidelines depending on which one you use. Tables and figures can now be embedded in the text. So it used to be that after your reference list, where your appendices would be, and then you would have tables and figures. Now they can be embedded in the text, which is great because it's typically where it makes the most sense to see it as a visual representation of information you may be providing or a more elaborate inclusion of information that you'd like to provide. They're now formatted consistently to each other. So there are some different guidelines, as I mentioned earlier, potentially for fonts and tables and figures, but now those two are more consistent with each other. There's also clear guidance for annotated bibliographies, which is really helpful because there is an APA format for bibliographies. Just a tip, did you know that you do not need to include a period after abbreviations for units of measurement? So common abbreviations for units of measurement, we can use them with the expectation that it's clear we're using an abbreviation. We do not need to use the period. An exception is inch. So there you can see I wrote IN with the period. And that's because the word in is a word. So we want to make it really clear we're saying inch, not in. So for example, if you saw LB, you don't have to do period. We know you're referring to pound. Just another tip, only use the word while when you're referring to simultaneous events. So I often see students will use while when really they could be using the word though or although. So although some people thought this, previous research suggested this, instead of while some people thought this, because while is a temporal reference. We're referring to time, and it suggests that things happen simultaneously. Another temporal reference that commonly is misused is the word since, S-I-N-C-E. So since is also something temporal. Since something happened, something else happened. So just something to be aware of. There's a larger section in this edition on avoiding bias language, and it is really, really helpful. Also, in the beginning of the manual, in the first few pages, you are able to see exactly who contributed and determined these guidelines. And I think that's really helpful, especially if you had questions about particular guidelines or maybe even disagreements with it. They included who was a part of each task force or group that determined those guidelines. And so that way we know who's really making these decisions. This is a quote directly from the manual. Ask people from the groups about which you are writing to read and comment on your material or consult with self-advocacy groups to determine appropriate terminology. If you work directly with participants, ask them what terms they use to describe themselves. And I would imagine the APA included that because terms do change over time. You know, the APA editions, they don't come out so frequently that I think they stay totally up to date with what is maybe happening around us culturally in the way that we can refer to different groups. So if you're ever unsure, ask the people themselves, or again, ask a self-advocacy group, consult with other people, make sure that you're using terms that are respectful and appropriate for whoever you're referring to. The APA gives direct guidelines so that you're describing people with appropriate specificity and also using sensitivity. So some examples for that. So we're talking about specificity, and this is on page 132 of the new manual. You want to focus on their relevant characteristics. So even sometimes we may collect demographic information. If it's not relevant, we don't need to include it. Acknowledge relevant differences that do exist. Be appropriately specific. So some examples there would be writing about age. If you had an exact age range, you should include it. When writing about disability, it's important to name the condition if you're aware of it, rather than speak too broadly. So for example, instead of saying something like people with disabilities or people with dementia, if you knew that your participants specifically had Alzheimer's disease, you should be specific. There's other examples provided in the manual. Another major change is that they can now be used as a gender neutral pronoun. And important point here. So while you can use they if you're referring to someone who identifies as gender non-binary or maybe trans, it's actually just overall in the writing, unless someone has specified their gender identity, you should default to using they. So an example would be if you had written a student can select which book to use, he or she should notify the instructor. Going forward, you would say a student can select which book to use, they should notify their instructor. So basically, unless you know the gender identities of who you're referring to, your default always using they because it is accepted as gender neutral. There's also guidelines for terms to describe age, disability, gender, participation in research, racial and ethnic identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and also intersectionality. So this is not new. There's only a few of these categories that are new for added guidelines in the 7th edition. That's participation in research, socioeconomic status, and intersectionality. So for participation in research, rather than referring to people broadly or vaguely by some identifying characteristic, such as women or people or children, you should be referring to them as clients or participants or patients, depending on what their role is and the group that they were in, and that was the basis of them being involved in the research. For socioeconomic status, the APA recommends using more of a strength perspective rather than deficit. So instead of saying things like low income, you should be specifying which range of income you're referring to. Instead of saying something like non-college educated, you could say high school educated or grade school educated. So that would be an example of using a strength approach versus speaking of people with a deficit. Also, if you're ever using a reference to people who are quote unquote at risk, APA says that that would not be appropriate. You have to specify why you're considering them at risk, what it is that makes someone be considered a part of that group. And again, being appropriately specific while also being sensitive. The added guidelines for intersectionality, I think, are really helpful because something you may notice when we typically read studies, the authors will report on the demographic characteristics of participants or the sample characteristics, but we don't really get a sense of any intersectionality. So in other words, we might read that members or participants in this study were 50% male, 50% female, and that they were, say, 30% identified as Hispanic or Latinx, and 50% identified as white, and 20% identified as Black. But what we're not getting there is the intersectionality. We don't get a sense of which identities or what were people's multiple identities. And depending what you're studying or what you're writing about, that can be relevant. An important note, though, going back to sensitivity, is you wouldn't want to define intersectionality so closely or specifically that someone would be able to read that section and be able to identify your participants. So for example, if I was doing a study and the participants included student athletes at a Division III public university in New Jersey, and I wrote very specifically about someone being on a specific sports team and their gender identity and their age and their race or ethnicity, it's possible that someone would be able to see my affiliation and actually look up that sports team roster and identify who I'm talking about. So you have to be careful there. It's a balance. We want to be clear in who we're referring to, but we don't want to identify people with such specificity that we could be compromising their privacy or confidentiality with their participation in the research. Okay, so just another tip, question yourself, why did you use a certain term or list groups in a certain order? So a lot of what we do in academia does happen through tradition. So it's important to pause whenever you're describing people or groups of people and ask yourself, why did I use these labels? Or why did I list them in this particular order? And be sure to convey what you need to convey to be meaningful and to be respectful and to avoid bias. There are also other additions to the manual. So there's now detailed guidance related to writing and publishing quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods articles. This is super helpful. I'm currently writing something that is based off of a qualitative study, and it's really been helpful to use the manual, and it gives very specific guidelines on what needs to be included and what can be omitted. There's also samples of a professional paper and a student paper. And again, there's different guidelines. So you can actually look right in the manual, you can see exactly what a title page should look like, and so on with the examples that they include. The section on journal article reporting standards, or JARS, is significantly expanded. So hopefully all of you at some point will be submitting for publication based on maybe a study or something that you've written. So you can use the APA manual to understand JARS, and it will help you prepare the manuscript. There's also now examples for every reference category. So even since the last edition of the APA manual, we've been able to access a lot of different references like podcasts and different types of online references and videos. And in the past, it was hard to figure out how exactly we include that on our reference list. In this manual, they really expanded on it and tried to include an example for every reference we could possibly be using. Just a tip here on the bottom, I advise investing in the manual. It's available online for around $20 to $35, and there's also a few hard copies that can be borrowed through our library. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a different price if you get the more fancy version of the manual with the tabs that's bound differently. And I think certain places have had it sold out. I haven't checked recently, but typically wherever you get your books, Barnes & Nobles, Target, Amazon, you should be able to find the manual. Okay, I'm gonna just cover some common APA style errors that we see. So the first one is anthropomorphism, and that's when we attribute human characteristics to inanimate sources or animals. So that includes studies and papers. For example, I will often see students write, the study concluded. Well, the study didn't do anything, right? The study's not alive. It's that the person included or the researcher concluded. And it is okay to refer to yourself. Actually, the APA encourages you to do so. So you can say, in this paper, I will. So caveat to that, I do know there are some instructors, for whatever reasons, they prefer that you do not do this. So if you're someone who does write in first person, make sure you check with your instructor to ensure that they would be okay with you doing that. But according to APA style, you can. The second example, this paper will review. Instead of referring to the paper as if it's animate and it's alive, you can say, in this paper, I will review. Also, some students aren't aware about self-plagiarism. So that would be whenever you are including your own writing from something you've previously wrote or especially published. It's okay to include your own writing, but you would cite it and use quotation marks just like you were using someone else's writing. And this happens a lot, I think, in graduate school, especially as you get more specific into a topic or area. You may find yourself submitting numerous assignments based on that topic. If you're ever using writing that you previously submitted, make sure that you're citing that because you don't want to make it seem like it's original work when it's not. I mentioned this point earlier, but again, it's not necessary to repeat the year and narrative citations in the same paragraph. And here I just have an example. So if I said Shortway 2020 found that apples and oranges could not be compared. Shortway suggested I don't need to include the year. It was made clear which reference I'm referring to. If you're citing information from the literature review or introduction of an article, it's likely that you're mistakenly citing a secondary source as if it was the primary source. And this is another mistake I commonly see. Literature reviews and introductions from other authors' papers are so helpful because it's telling us all these different sources that are related to what we're reading about or what we're studying. But we can't cite that information directly from that source unless we include as cited in. Best practice is to note the reference, go to the reference list, and go to yourself to that original source, and then you can cite that source. There's also guidelines for using abbreviations, including introducing the abbreviation in the body of the text. So for example, if you go back to the beginning of this presentation, I first wrote out American Psychological Association, I had parentheses, APA, and then onward, I can just refer to APA. So I first have to introduce that though. There are some phrases and terms that according to APA style, you never need to introduce their abbreviations. They're well known and therefore not necessary. So one example is IQ. You don't have to write out intelligence quotient. It's universally understood that that's what you'd be referring to. So you're using IQ from the beginning. There are guidelines for capitalization, including capitalized racial and ethnic groups. So this is something that people are commonly unsure of. For example, if I was referring to Black women, I would be capitalizing the B in Black. The same would be for white women or any other race or ethnicity that we're referring to. Also, it's worth mentioning here, this is included in the section of avoiding bias. I commonly still see people refer to people as Caucasian. That's actually a very archaic way of classifying people. So if you are referring to someone of European origins, and again, depending on their nationality, you might, and depending on the relevance of why you're reporting it, you can say white, or you'd be saying European American. If you could be more specific, again, it goes back to those specific specificity and sensitivity guidelines, but the APA directly states you should not be using the term Caucasian. Also, do not capitalize diseases, disorders, therapies, treatments, theories, or models. So, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, it would all be lowercase, unless, of course, it was at the start of the sentence, then the C would be capitalized. If you're saying a disorder, for example, generalized anxiety disorder, it should not be capitalized. So the same for all the theories, models, treatments, etc. Just another tip, you may need to look back at your CV or your resume to make sure that any publications and presentations that you list are incorrect APA style. This is something I personally haven't done yet. I know there's going to be a period of transition. If you are, for whatever reason, submitting your CV or resume to others, you may want to think about whether or not the people receiving it would be expecting it in APA style 6 or 7, or it could be that they're really not concerned with APA style, especially if it's outside of academia, but it's something to consult about, and know that eventually we'll all need to make sure that they're in APA style 7. So continuing with some common APA style errors. When we have multiple references in an in-text citation, they should be in alphabetical order, not in order of the year, which would be chronological, and not in order of how much it contributed to whatever the statement was that you're discussing in the paper. An easy way to remember this is it's the same as the reference list. So here you can see those authors are in alphabetical order, and it's the same way they would appear on the reference list. Also, when citing a chapter in an edited book, you should be citing the author or authors of that chapter, not the editor or editors. So often on a textbook, when it's an edited book, it's the editor's names on the cover. And unfortunately, those editors often end up getting credit for the author's work. If you're citing from an edited book, you need to make sure that you're citing the authors of that chapter. And in the reference list, the way that you reference an edited book is different if it was a book that wasn't edited and all of the work was written by the same author or authors. Also note there's differences between short and block quotations. So it's a short quotation, it's directly in the text with quotation marks. If it's a block quotation, you're not using quotation marks. There's a different way of including it. And the way you would decide if it's short or block is a simple word count. If it's more than 40 words, it's a block quotation. If it's less than 40 words, it's written as a short quotation. Punctuation is included after the citation in a direct quote, although there are some exceptions. So here you can see my example. Shortway stated, "You cannot compare apples to oranges." I do not include the period before the quotation marks. They're after the last parentheses. The exception would be if maybe that ended with a question mark, and I would want to put the question mark within the quote to make that clear that it was a question. Also notice I have page with P period, not PG, and note that there's a space. So it's P period, a space, and then the number 1, which is telling the reader that I got that quote from page 1 of that text. Something else people often don't realize is that if you're citing authors with the same surname or last name, you should include their initials. So let's say that I wrote a paper and I cited 2 authors who had a common name. For my example, the name is common name. Every single time I referenced or cited either one of those authors, I'm always including their first initials, and it's actually before their last name. So that again can be a little confusing, but I just want to be clear on that. So if it was common name, every time common name is cited, whichever author it is, I'm including the author's initials to make it clear. Also, lots of mistakes typically happen around numbers. For numbers 10 or above, we're using numerals. There are some exceptions. So if you're writing something with numbers and you're unsure, this is a time you would definitely want to open up the manual and check it out. But generally speaking, if it's 10 or larger, we're using numerals. An exception is if it's the start of a sentence. We don't want to start a sentence with a number. So here you can see in my example, 15 students expressed their interest in the workshop. Instead of starting with 1-5, I wrote it out as 15 with capital F. Okay, we're going to take a few moments here for a practice activity. The instructions are to read the passage below to identify the errors that need revision to be consistent with APA style. So feel free if you just want to glance at this and make note in your mind, or if you have something to write with and you want to jot it down. I'm just going to give you a minute or two to read this and see if you can identify the APA style errors, and then we'll review them together. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through this and identify some of the errors. If that wasn't enough time and you're watching the recording, feel free to pause. Otherwise, if you didn't get all the way through it, no worries, we're gonna go over this together. All right, so let's review. So first of all, with the headings, so I have references for writing, which is a level 2 heading. The following heading, which is a subheading, should have been a level 3 heading. So that is incorrect the way I have it. There's also an error that in the second sentence, I refer to the APA. However, when I refer to the American Psychological Association in the first sentence, I did not introduce that abbreviation. So I would have needed to put in parentheses APA, and then going forward, I could simply refer to APA. Just a side note, if you have organizations or authors or whatever it is you're referring to that you're abbreviating that are very similar, you shouldn't use the abbreviation. So let's say in the same paper, I referred to the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association. I'm not going to use APA for either of them because that just introduces confusion, and the purpose of abbreviations are to make it more simple. So here I'm just referring to American Psychological Association. So I could have introduced the abbreviation and then I could use it going forward. It was published over 10 years ago. So 10 should be written out numerically, 10. Here we have one change is that more font types are now acceptable to use, and disabled people who use assistive technology may prefer the new fonts. That is incorrect because I should not be saying disabled people. According to the guidelines of avoiding biased language, it's person first. So I should be saying people with disabilities. Again, if I could refer to someone more specifically or a group more specifically, I should be doing that. But people with disabilities is what should be written there. There are also guidelines for writing journal articles. 14 people contributed to the task force on journal article reporting standards, and their contributions greatly improved the new edition. So that whole part is underlined just because it's not really written concisely. In APA style, we're trying to write as concisely as possible. There's probably ways I could have combined those sentences and written more directly. Also, the error is that I start one sentence with a number. So 14 should have been written out as 14. Starting with capital letter F. A student will need to refer to the new edition if he or she wants to succeed in scholarly writing tasks. Here, I should be using a gender neutral pronoun, so it should be if they want to succeed. And again, you may have had teachers or other people in your past who are correcting you, because I think this is something a lot of people tend to do already, is they would write they, but now it's actually what you're supposed to do. So you should say if they want to succeed. As a side note, the current author of this passage, and it even sounds a little pretentious saying it, I should just be saying I. So as a side note, I appreciated. It's implied that I'm the author if I'm referring to myself as I. Overuse of the M dash weakens the flow of material, so use it judiciously. There should be a period only after the parentheses, so it should not be included within quotation marks. The G is not necessary, it should be P period. I then again refer to that author. I should just be saying I. Used a ton is incorrect because we can't use any type of cliches or metaphors or things that we may speak commonly in academic writing with APA style. Again, we can be sharing things cross-culturally, internationally, and different, even within different regions of the same state or even within the same institution. We don't all speak with the same language. So we want to eliminate, avoid any confusion and speak directly and not saying things like used a ton, because of course I didn't literally use a ton of M dashes. There's also of stated twice, so that's an error. And what M dashes are is it sort of looks like a hyphen, but it's a little bit longer. I do overuse them. I love using them because I think that's conversationally how I speak. But yeah, you should not use them too often. And the last error here is that I included all 4 authors, but because it's more than 2 authors, it would just be Shortway et al. From the very beginning. All right, so hopefully this has all been very helpful for you. There's some additional resources that the APA provides. Here you can see, we also have a blog. I haven't gone on to all of these yet, but they are included in the manual as helpful resources. You can also visit the Kane University Writing Center. I know there's been talk of people from the Writing Center coming over to our campus more often. You can also contact me if I can be of any assistance. Again, just realize I'm not a representative from APA in any way in providing this presentation. We're really glad you were able to join us today, or for those who are listening to the recording, I'm really glad that you were able to join us. I hope that this has been helpful. We are going to be providing more webinars and presentations in the future as docs, so I really hope you join us going forward. And as I said in the beginning, I want to give some time for any questions. So please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or anything I can help you with.
Okay, so as folks start getting the questions together, if there are any, I actually had a question, and you may have covered this, but I wanted you to reiterate, if possible, on the use of hyperlinks. So in the past, when entering either a source in the reference list, or even like a footnote under a figure, or let's say a table or something, there may have been a hyperlink, and folks were asked to take those off so that everything is of that dark font as opposed to that blue underline. Any guidance on that?
Yeah, my understanding is you're including it as a hyperlink. So when you put in the hyperlink, and I know at least in Word, so it does appear blue, like you could actually click on it. So you're keeping it like that as is.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's my understanding. It may be something we want to check back in the manual, but I think the idea again is that most documents are shared virtually. So if it was printed out, that would look funny that it was underlined, or maybe would appear like it was shaded differently. But they're meant to actually be hyperlinks so that we can click on them.
Yeah. No, it does make sense to me if it were, if you were able to click on it, because like you said, I mean, everything is is shared virtually so much nowadays that having access to that link, I mean, the point of sources and references is to give the reader access. So it would make sense. That's something that I have to go into the manual myself and look at as well. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. Are there any questions? Okay, well, if there are no questions, we can stop the recording if you'd like.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.